A reading of the book, Narrative Dynamics, written by Melanie and Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story. Chapter 7. Dynamics Quads, Part 1. The last couple of days I've been thinking about what elements would be in quads of dynamics. In the current Dramatica structural model, dynamics are only in pairs, such as time lock and option lock. So, if these two items were in a quad of dynamics, what would the other two items be? Today, I have my answer, and its ramifications and implications range much farther than I thought, all the way into new perspectives from which to appreciate the existing Dramatica structural model. In fact, it turns out that every structural quad already contains shadows and influences of dynamic quads inherent within and integral to their functioning. In other words, the structural model would not operate at all if it did not already include reflections and harmonics of the dynamic model which has not yet been developed. Think of a hologram as opposed to a photograph. If you cut a photo in two, each has only half the object. But if you cut a hologram in two, each half sees the whole picture but only from half the points of view. In the current model of Dramatica, we only have the half of the hologram, yet it sees the entire nature of narrative, just from a portion of the available perspectives. In fact, just as in the Dramatica model itself, there are 4 points of view from which to explore narrative: a structural view of structure, a structural view of dynamics, a dynamic view of structure, and a dynamic view of dynamics. The current model provides only the first of these, the structural view of structure. But wait a minute. How then is it possible that it contains dynamics at all? Because the nature of a quad of anything is that 3 of the 4 items will appear to be of the same family, while the 4th item will seem a bit out of place, out of left field, as it sort of belongs halfway but has a foot in another camp. In fact, this is true. Quads are not truly all part of the same plane, but a squashed helix. They are a flat projection onto a 2-dimensional plane of a 3D phenomenon, like looking at a slinky toy end-on so that it appears to be a circle. From this perspective, we perceive one circuit around the helix as a family passing through 4 quadrants, like going through 90, 180, 270 and 360 degrees in a Cartesian plane in trigonometry. But that vertical rise that is flattened out doesn't disappear, it is just swept under the carpet as we mentally try to make the first 3 items in a quad appear as much as possible as part of the same family so we can get a mental grip on them, ascribe a common umbrella understanding to the group. Still, by the time you get to that last item in the quad family, you have all this leftover vertical rise in your pocket and you have to shove it into the quad before you move on to the next. And so, the last item in the quad picks up all the slack, which moves it halfway between belonging in one family and halfway into belonging to the next by nature, by meaning. This is the structural view of a quad. A more accurate view would see each element as moving 1/4 of the way toward the next family, but then the whole quad could no longer be treated as a single family unit. So what's wrong with that? Only by grouping 4 perspectives, the mass, energy, space, and time of a thing, into a single family, are we able to understand the structural nature of the thing as it exists. This is why the circle seems closed, why it becomes a closed system as a quad, why it appears to create a family, why it seems structural, why it seems as if each family is a closed unit within that circle that make it a structural element in an even larger quad. What we lose, however, is the vertical aspect, the vertical quad, as the helix continues upward through the z-axis through 4 iterations, 4 levels, a quad of dynamics which represent that we cannot see anything from all 4 perspectives at once. We can only take one point of view at a time. To see all 4, we must shift from one to another, and that takes time, as represented in the vertical axis. Essentially, this accounts for the fact that by the time we have seen all 4 perspectives, what we are observing may have changed, or we may have changed in the process. Again, this creates a new quad: the object is the same and we are the same, the object is the same and we are changed, the object has changed and we are the same, the object has changed and we have changed. That was the structural view of those 4 relationships. The dynamic view would be: the object and observer do not change each other, the object changes the observer, the object is changed by the observer, the object and the observer change each other. If the Dramatica chart were only seen in the flat projection, the whole vertical progression, the structural view and therefore also first step toward a dynamic view of narrative, would be all we had. But, since the Dramatica model can also be seen in a three-dimensional chart, the familiar four towers, the nature of the helices can be seen in the progression around the quads, families of quads and so on, from the bottom of the model to the top, or from the top down. With this in mind, we can see that the flat projection, the 3D projection, and the sequence of progression through the elements along the helices are three parts of another quad family in the current model. What is the fourth part? The 8 dynamic questions themselves. These questions are the part of the model that is most out of left field, most different from the other three, and the one that picks up all the slack of the journey toward a purely dynamic model. The 8 dynamic questions function to twist and turn the model, whereas the other three aspects are passive, structural, positioned by their natures as opposed to their functions. Keep in mind, now, that every element of the Dramatica model actually represents a process of the mind. These are not elements so much as named processes. For example, in truth we don't have faith, rather we are engaged in the process of being faithful. The mind is a machine made of time, every gear and pulley is a process, not an object. These functions must be continuously in motion or they cease to exist. If the mind stops, it dies. But, from a structural view, if we see a process perpetually ongoing within the span of our observation, such as the red spot on Jupiter, we treat the process as an object and call it a storm or even a feature. So, from this perspective, the dynamic questions differ from the rest of the structural model by describing the processes that twist and turn the model into different arrangements. In other words, dynamics in the current model are the processes that arrange the other processes. Simply put, if the structural model can be seen as fractals of families within families, quads within quads, then each element or item in the model can be seen as a variable in which the value is the intensity or power of each process. Change the power and you fill a different number in the variable and get a different kind of iteration from one fractal level to the next. The dynamic questions, then, are not changing the value of the variables, but the value of the operations in the equations. In other words, dynamics are changing the value of the functions in the equations, which operations will be employed in which order, which changes not the nature of the iterations, but the nature of the iterator. Now this is pretty much what we already knew. But I was always plagued by wondering why the dynamics were in 8 pairs rather than 8 quads. I had tried to combine these 16 values into 4 quads of 4, but they never fit. It was like each pair was half a quad. But why would that be? My best guess was that, like the 4 items in any quad, you can only see one foot, while the other is in a different family. So, from a structural view of structure, you can only see half of each of the dynamic quads. Now that just motivated me. While I realized that for the structural view of structure, the Dramatica model was complete and, therefore, both accurately analytic and predictive, but it was only 1/4 of the capital T truth. I wanted to know what was in the other 3/4, especially that final fourth, that last of 4 complete models that is the dynamic view of dynamics, the one that will contain 4 aspects of its own and the very last one will have 1 foot in the next family, the family beyond mind, beyond universe, a hint of something outside our own existence, just as the dynamic questions are a hint of what lies beyond structure. I'll probably never see it through that far in my lifetime, but that tantalizing possibility keeps me working, every day, on trying to get there, to catch a glimpse of that great unknown before I shuffle off this mortal helix.